Welcome back to Let's Make a Game. In this video, I would like to go through very briefly 3 settings that have been published for tabletop role-playing games, which I think are quite interesting and quite potentially inspirational for people who are looking to make a setting of their own for a role-playing game, whether it be tabletop or computer, and which are relatively little known. I don't want to describe the settings in complete detail. I'm going to leave a lot out. I just want to talk about them enough to let you know whether it's something you feel like you might be interested in. And then if you are interested in them, you can follow them up. And I will briefly, at the end of the video, talk about how you can get documents relating to these settings if you decide that's something you want to do. So, as I said, there are 3. Space 1889 is the first one I'm going to talk about. Then I'm going to talk about the setting of Empire of the Petal Throne. And finally, I'm going to talk about a setting called Weird Adventures. So, starting with Space 1889, this was originally published in 1988, I believe. Yep, 1988. There has been at least one other game that uses the same setting, but a completely different set of rules. There was a version for Savage Worlds. Savage Worlds, if you don't know, is a rule system for tabletop role-playing games. But I am going to talk about the original version. The original version is remembered fondly for its setting and not its rules. Most people who played it seem to say that the rules are quite clunky, but I'll talk briefly about that. So, as you might have guessed from just looking at the cover, the setting is what we would now call steampunk, although I don't believe they ever use that word. They describe it as being based on Victorian science fiction and Victorian discredited Victorian scientific theories, which of course is, you'd say, oh, well, that's steampunk. Although I think steampunk has sort of become a thing in itself. It's become a sort of aesthetic in its own right. So, perhaps it's slightly different. But anyway, the idea is that space travel within the solar system was discovered in the Victorian era. It is much cheaper and more practical than space travel in real life, so that an individual can hope to successfully build a spaceship and fly to another planet. And excuse me, and the other planets are inhabitable by humans and often inhabited by their own species. And the imperial powers of Earth have colonized parts of the solar system in a way that is analogous to how they were colonizing parts of Africa and Asia in particular in real history. Most of it is set on Mars. It does describe Venus and the asteroid belt and the moon and so on, often quite, in quite a lot of detail. But the focus of the setting very quickly became Mars. That became the thing that the players were most interested in, I think, and that they made most material for. These are the native Martians. They're sort of elf or goblin looking things. This is one representation of them. I've seen others where they look more sort of elf-like, more sort of human-like. Um, but that doesn't. I mean, it doesn't really matter what they look like. I suppose that's just that's a detail that can be easily changed. There was an idea in. You can just vaguely see this in the background. I don't know how clear it is in the video, but you can see that there's a sort of desert landscape, and then there's a canal with a strip of green along each side of the canal. Um, and that is an idea that was fairly common uh, in the late 19th century. It wasn't taken seriously by most scientists. Um, there was a particular astronomer who believed in it quite firmly, but most scientists didn't take it seriously. But it was very widely known, and that idea was that Mars uh, was a sort of dying world. There was an idea that that Mars had been created, had formed before Earth, and Earth had been formed before Venus. Um, that idea is now also discredited. I think in Space 1889 it's probably true. But Mars, being an older world, it was a dying world. The water, the seas had dried up and it had become a desert world. But the Martians, being more advanced than humans, had been able to create a network of canals that bring ice or bring water from the ice caps and irrigate the planet. The origin of this idea was that was astronomers looking at Mars and seeing sort of a mostly reddy orange field, but then they would sometimes see darker marks, and the idea was that those were not they weren't exactly the canals, because the canals would be uh, far too thin to be seen from Earth. But what they were was that they were strips of vegetation. They were the green bits, sort of, that were for a few miles on either side of the canals. Um, so in Space 1889, that is the situation, and the British in particular um, have colonized Mars. This map is a bit misleading because this darker bit looks like it's oceans, but it's not. On Mars, all water has sort of dried. There are no seas except for there is no water except for at the ice caps. But so Britain in particular, yeah, it's from 1988. So the art standards of the time were not as they are today. So you've just got to deal with that. Some people find that a bit charming, but anyway, the it's a slightly better version of, looks like it's the same two characters. Um, the assumption is that most of the characters will be humans. It is possible to play various Martians and Venusians if you want to, but most of the options are for humans. One of the interesting things about the rules, people say the rules are clunky, but there is one very interesting thing about the rules, which is the character ideas. They don't have character classes, but they do have sort of, I guess, collections of skills. So they say, they call them careers, I think. So you have sort of the different levels of different skills and stuff that you might have as a member of various types of, in particular, Victorian Englishman or American seems to be the sort of default assumption. Although again, you don't have to do that. Social class is very important, as it is as it was in real history. Most of the skills require particular social classes. So, for example, if you want to be in the army, what you are very much depends on your social class. So, if you're social class 1, then you're a sort of low-ranking soldier. If you're social class 3, you're an officer, or you know, and then in a sort of less prestigious regiment, and then social class 5 and 6, you're an officer in one of the more prestigious regiments like the cavalry, and so on. And so you can be a diplomat, that requires particular social class. You can be a big game hunter, an explorer, a dilettante traveller, which of course requires a high social class. Reporter, all the sort of, yeah, they have quite a lot of good ideas for you know, Victorian style careers. Various types of criminal. To be a master criminal requires a sort of high social class, I believe, and to be a poacher requires a low social class, I think. Yep, three or less. You can be a detective, obviously a Sherlock Holmes, Sherlock Holmes type of reference, and so on. But the main, so yeah, I think that section on the different careers and the requirements of the different careers and the skills that different sorts of people would have is actually quite a good guide to sort of really real Victorian society. I mean, you wouldn't have to use that for science fiction. You could have a game set in like a more historical version of Victorian society, and I think this would be quite useful for you. But the other thing that's the most interesting, I think, is the description of Mars, which is a dying desert world, partly colonized by various European powers, in particular the British, and inhabited by. There's another portrait of sort of one version of what the native Martians look like. Inhabited by various sort of subspecies of Martian, which range from the decadent Martians of the canals to the brutish sort of really sort of savages that are meant to be the enemy, which is the high Martians, the ones who live in the mountains, who can actually fly, and then they have sort of horse riding Martians of the plains who are meant to be sort of more sympathetic, noble savage types, I suppose. They don't ride horses exactly; they ride the sort of horse analog. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through. There's a fair bit of sort of, I guess, steampunk technology, different kinds of imaginary, weaponry and stuff like the electric rail gun, and so on. The other thing that's most interesting to me about the setting is the airships of Mars. It's said that another not great piece of artwork. The justification is that on Mars there is a native wood called liftwood, which is somehow naturally lighter than air, but as the name suggests, lifts or sort of can lift any weight, but only when it's aligned in a particular way to the surface of the planet. And so you have ships that are based on lattices of sort of almost Venetian blinds, like liftwoods, and Venetian blinds made of liftwood that sort of face downwards, and you open them to go down, and you close them to go up, and you can sort of hold it steady by holding it diagonally. So it's this sort of quite charmingly old-fashioned idea of technology. to make an airship. And there are of course airship pirates, and there are airship explorers. Sometimes the airship explorers might interact with the high Martians of the mountains who can fly naturally, and they act as sort of pirates and slavers. They fly down and capture people and enslave them. And so one of the things that you might be doing in the setting is trying to rescue a slave, or you might be a captive and be trying to escape, for example. They do actually have quite a lot of suggestions for adventures in different parts of the setting. This, I think, shows they really wanted to, they sort of wanted to be Indiana Jones a little bit, because this was the 80s and Victorian times were not something that anyone had any interest in, but Indiana Jones was very popular. So some of the artwork sort of suggests that they were kind of wishing that they were doing Indiana Jones instead. But anyway, yeah, one of the things that's quite good about this is probably the last thing I'll say. One of the things that's quite good about this is that they have suggestions for adventures organised by place, if that makes sense. So they might say, okay, well, the high Martians, one of the things you could be doing is you're a naturalist who's exploring them to, well, here's an example. The characters uncover a plot to penetrate the closely guarded Bhutan spice fields. Bhutan in this is sort of a drug, an exotic alien drug. In an attempt to obtain cuttings of the spice plant and break the League's monopoly on spice production, the characters try to obtain a load of liftwood for themselves and brave the dangers of the highlands, and so on. And so there's other. Oh, actually, I'll read some of the others. While the characters are traversing a desert along the route of a dead canal, meaning a canal that's no longer has water flowing through it, they discover that the oasis shown on the map has dried up or is surrounded by hostile hill Martians, and they must seek out an alternate source of water or suffer the ravages of dehydration. A city-state has closed one of the Grand Canals to traffic. The intersections of the canals are cities, and that's where the slightly decadent, more civilized Martians live. A city-state has closed one of the Grand Canals to traffic. The players must be resourceful and find a way past the guard boats to continue on their journey. While visiting a bazaar on the bank of a Grand Canal, the characters are attracted to the canal's edge by a commotion going on near an unfamiliar barge, which is attempting to breach itself there. All right, so I think I've said enough to let you know whether this is something you might be interested in. So let's get rid of that and let's move on to Weird Adventures. This is probably the most obscure one, and it's also the most recent one. Who was it by? I keep forgetting the guy's name. Oh, Trey Causey, who is a blogger, and he sort of collected a lot of his ideas. And this doesn't have any rules. Again, this is exclusively a setting, and it is broadly a pulp setting. And this I think sums up the idea. Monster killing and treasure hunting meet the pulp era. Well, monster killing and treasure hunting is really just a way of saying Dungeons and Dragons style fantasy, right? So the idea is, what if there was a world like early to mid 20th century Earth, and specifically early to mid 20th century United States, although it does deal with other parts of the world. The core is really dealing with the analog to the United States. But in that world, a lot of the conventions of Dungeons and Dragons were real. In other words, there were lost cities and uh, you know, underground treasures and woods filled with monsters and so on. So it's a kind of way of trying to, trying to have a sort of D&D, almost a Dungeons and Dragons economy with the visual style of the 20th century, um, and of sort of the combination of the historical 20th century and pulp fiction, I suppose, in the original sense of the pulps. So it's specifically in between the world wars. So speaking of Indiana Jones, it's sort of similar, um, similar time period to Indiana Jones, or at least a sort of analog of that. But as I say, it's a D&D world. So, for example, there's an analog of New York, which is the big city. But in the big city, there's a neighborhood called Little. I'll read this out because I find this quite interesting, and it sort of sums up the. There's a neighborhood called Little Carcosa. This is the New York analog with all of these different neighborhoods. I'll just see if there we go. Little Carcosa. Okay. Little Carcosa is one of the city's most mysterious ethnic enclaves. Its narrow cobblestone streets, exotically dressed residents, and unusual scents give the feeling of stepping into the old world. Though where in the old world is part of the mystery. The Carcosan homeland doesn't appear on any known map. The people of Little Carcosa are as enigmatic as their homeland's location. Their swarthy complexions and the cadences of their speech recall the Near East, perhaps some place in the empire of Korambek. Their clothing, manner, and ever-present smiles make one think instead of the Far East and Yian. Yian is the China analogue in this. Besides its general ambience, Little Carcosa holds other delights for the visitor. Its markets are small but often have unusual items imported from all over the globe. The primary local crafts are hand-carved masks, both fanciful and grotesque, which are sought by a small and dedicated group of collectors. Their spicy cuisine is an acquired taste, but some city gourmets extol its exotic charms. A rare treat is Little Carcosa's street festival. Its occurrence is hard to predict, based as it is on their arcane sidereal calendar, but the Carcosans must plan for it well in advance, despite no visible outward preparation. Young and old alike take to the streets in masks, forming a raucous procession following a group of clowns. These clowns are master contortionists and possibly even illusionists of some sort, because, of course, in this world, magic is a real thing, performing feats that scarcely seem humanly possible and sometimes border on grotesque. So, obviously, that's a sort of fantasy version of exploring a city. This reminded me of sort of experiences I've had myself. You explore a city and you find a sort of a weird neighborhood. You find a Chinatown, or assuming Chinatown is weird to you. I'm a white person, so I'm sort of speaking from that perspective. You find a Chinese neighborhood or a Russian neighborhood or something, and you're sort of looking at all these fascinating things, not knowing what they are. And then they've expanded that into a sort of fantasy idea that wouldn't work in real life. There's this ethnic group and no one knows where they came from. They are literally mysterious. They're not just mysterious to you. They're mysterious. They're objectively mysterious. They just sort of turned up and no one knows where they're from. I think that gives a quite good idea of the setting. If you some people combining genres. Some people really like it, and some people find it really sort of dumb and annoying. I tend to quite like it. So, but if you're interested in sort of that idea, which I think is quite interesting, of combining sort of America in the somewhere about the 1920s or 30s or 40s with the tropes of sort of fantasy adventuring. It is a setting that you might be interested in. So I'll pass on from this one fairly quickly. This is probably the one that has the least material for it. There's this book, and then there's a free download on his, or at least there was a free download on his blog as well. But I'll get to that when we get to the end of the video, and I'll deal now with my third third and final setting, the world of Empire of the Petal Throne. Now, there have been many rule systems for Empire of the Petal Throne. I'm more interested in the setting than in the system. But I'm going to recommend one document in particular, which is Swords and Glory, Volume 1. Well, most people pronounce this Tekumel. I think it's meant to be pronounced Tekumei. But I'm just saying Tekumel. That seems to be what everyone else says. Tekumel Sourcebook, The World of the Petal Throne. Now, this is a combination, this world is a combination of science fiction and fantasy, but it's not derived from medieval Europe at all. It's really more like perhaps some sort of combination of the Aztecs and ancient and medieval India. The person who wrote it was a professor of Urdu, among other things, I think. And so he sort of drew on his knowledge of Asian culture or of South Asian, Indian culture in particular in creating this. The idea is that there was a spacefaring sort of galactic civilization with multiple species. There was a horrible disaster, and this planet, as part of this disaster, this planet was sent into a sort of pocket dimension. So it's isolated from the galactic civilization. Technology collapsed. It has become basically roughly medieval, although again, not so much medieval Europe. But there is sort of remaining technology. There's leftover technology from the days of the galactic civilization, which is almost treated as basically as sort of magic items. And there is a very sort of rigid caste-based society, which, although there are several species on the planet, the assumption is that the players will be humans. The reason I recommend this particular source book is it has no rules. It's purely just a description of the world. The other thing I'd say is that there are after entering the pocket dimension, they made contact with these sort of extra dimensional beings who they treat essentially as gods or demons, although the assumption is that they seem to be just more advanced material beings. The reason it's interesting is the level of detail. There's quite a. I mean, this here is all about the language. He didn't skimp on writing the details. He seems to have written a complete actual language. He was a professor of languages, so I assume it's a fairly what's the word? Like a plausible language. There's systems of weights and measures. There's descriptions of the flora and fauna, the different aliens. The aliens are very interesting. I might look that up. I'll see if they've got a picture. Actually, there's one that's in that's particularly interesting. There's uh, the sort of the society, which again is based on sort of a caste system, which um, does lead me to a um, a quite important caveat. The author of this book, um, M.A.R. Barker, uh, it came out after his death that he had been a neo-Nazi, um, not a not a right winger. You know, I'm not using Nazi sort of metaphorically. He was literally a Nazi. He literally thought the wrong side won World War II, and does you know does that sort of leak into the setting? Well, it does. I think you can sort of see it once you know to look for it. You can see the influence of those beliefs. He's obviously very happy with this rigid caste-based system. Um, this quite horrible society. He describes it. He seems to describe it as being sort of something that he quite likes, even though it's objectively quite horrible, or quite horrible to anyone who's not a neo-Nazi, I suppose. Um, it doesn't have racism, at least not obvious racism. Um, the people there aren't any white people in this setting. The people who the humans are all descended from sort of non-white. I know that's not a very scientific term, but from people from sort of South America and Asia. The idea is that in the history of this world, Earth suffered a nuclear war, and civilization ceased, and then when it started again, that's the civilization that went into space, and that was not centered on Europe. So in other words, there was sort of our future. There was the real world. In this world, there was sort of real history. Then there was a nuclear war, and then thousands of years later, civilization re-established itself, and that civilization went into space and established the sort of galactic society. But that civilization wasn't dominated by Europe and North America, and so the people here are sort of the descendants of mostly of sort of Indians and South Americans. So there's not obvious white supremacy, but it's the sort of society that a fascist would like. I mean, it's a society of rigid caste. So I'm a H.P. Lovecraft fan, and H.P. Lovecraft was quite a horrible person and had some very horrible views. And his horrible views inspired a lot of the writing that I like. A lot of his writing is about the horror of discovering that you have some sort of foul and evil ancestry, right? Which is an obvious metaphor for racial fears. But I can see why people wouldn't want to, I can see why people would say, well, that's not fun, that's horrible, and I can't look past that. And I think that's fair enough. But anyway, letting you know that that's the case. Again, it's not an obviously racist setting, but it is a setting of rigid castes and sort of complete oppression, which the author seems to be quite happy about, I suppose you'd say. And if you're interested in it, I would recommend this source book because, as I say, it is completely rule-free. It's just about the setting. I might just quickly 1.413. I'll see if I can. It doesn't look like it's got any pictures, unfortunately, so I can't talk about. I wanted to show a picture of one of the. Oh no, it's got some pictures. Some of the aliens are quite interesting. In particular, there's a There we go. There's a species called the Ayog, Ahogya. A lot of the stuff's quite difficult to pronounce. Um, who are these sort of uh, symmetrical sort of monstrous creatures. They've got sort of four. I think I can't remember whether it's four or six. Looks like four, four faces and four arms and four legs, and so they can't be snuck up on, among other things. And they're considered legally to be animals because they don't have any religion, and so therefore they're not taxed. And in the minds of the dominant society, to be human is to have a religion, and so therefore, even though they're clearly intelligent, they're considered to be animals, which means they're not taxed, and also they sort of don't have particular protections in the law. So that's an interesting. I find that a quite interesting example of a very alien way of thinking. Um, so that is Swords and Glory. The other thing I would recommend from this setting is the Book of Ebon Bindings. This is a book about magic, but again, it is rule free. Or it's a book about magic and sort of the names of the gods and so on. The distinction, they call them demons in this, but the distinction between gods and demons is, it's a matter of perspective sort of thing. I think Terry Pratchett famously said that the distinction between gods and demons is like the distinction between terrorists and freedom fighters. And that seems to be the case in this setting, that they're all just alien beings, and some of them are sort of helpful and some of them are hostile. They're not sort of inherently different creatures. It's sort of like weeds. I suppose it's like weeds and plants. A weed is just a plant that is considered to be not useful. But anyway, onto this book. Why is it interesting? The reason it is interesting is because it is a book of spells and sort of related subjects, written in an in-universe style, i.e. it's not a set of rules for having spells. It's like a manual for magic in the universe of the Petal Throne. And it has quite a lot of, it has quite a lot of very elaborate rituals. The core of this, the thing that I find most interesting about it, is this very long, detailed description of a spell, which, if this is done and these people are sacrificed and so on, then eventually you will evoke this particular demon if it's done in a particular place. It's sort of, it's full of elaborate sort of interesting detail, which, if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's very flavorful. It's quite grim. A lot of the magic involves a lot of sacrifice. A lot of people have to die to cast a spell, and the spells are often quite baleful. They often have quite sort of bad, bad effects. But of course, you can be spells that you're trying to stop. It doesn't. You don't have to sort of approve of them. And the names of the demons are quite interesting too. The hairy-legged mouth and the beast without a tail. The lord of the northeast quadrant of the demon's plain, and also of the sixth circle, is the mighty beast without a tail, the one foretold of antiquity, the insensate one, the ruler of the monoliths of speaking terror, the one who returns to the plain. Perhaps a reference to the legend of Lord Casserol's famous battle on Dor Moron Plain against all of the other gods, and the one worshipped in the scarlet halls. And it says no further reference to this exists. It's got this quite interesting sort of, this is a translation of a thing that some of this stuff I don't really know what it means, and so he's just sort of passing it on as if it's incomplete, as if it's a document in the real world of some subject that isn't completely known. That's often true in real archaeology and real sort of translations of old myths and stuff. There's often references and things that we don't have any we don't have any we don't have the reference has been lost, and so we don't know exactly what it means. And so on. And there's sort of anecdotes about attempts to summon him and so forth. I speak now of the manifestation of the beast without a tail. Know that he is a vast creature, possessing 8 limbs like tall pillars of black basalt, nigh 10 cubits in height, with a long and supple body which is never wholly of this plane at any time. The beast has such thick fur or hair upon his person that the contours of his shape are obscured from the eye, although one can see that his shoulders are muscled and corded and ribbed and sheathed with power. His head is like that of a hooked beast, chlen beast, and the chlen is a common beast of burden in this setting, save that it is flatter, longer, and broader across the forehead. Moreover, his head is fleshy and not of horn, and so on and so on. So, if you're into sort of elaborate details and elaborate mythologies and elaborate sort of systems of magic and of mythology, and that sort of relate to sort of self-contained and lists of elaborate titles and things that relate to each other, you will find this interesting. This is not about. This is a sort of specific side of the world of the Petal Throne. The other document, if I had to tell you to look at one, I'd probably say to look at the other one. Look at the Swords and Glory source book, because that's a general description of the world. But if you want to get more into the magic and the demonology and so on, this is quite good. With, of course, the caveat that it was made by a horrible, horrible person. So, before I end this video, I'm going to briefly talk about where to get these documents. And I have to be a bit circumspect about this because I don't want to sort of tell you to do anything illegal. But I will say this. There are sites such as scribd.com, SCRIBD.com, which have which are document sharing sites, and you can often find material for old role-playing games. So this is probably more relevant to Space 1889 and Empire of the Petal Throne than to Weird Adventures, because Weird Adventures, the person who made it is still sort of fairly active, I think. But for the old ones, you can find sites like scribd.com that often have old role-playing game PDFs that you can download. Sometimes you have to upload a document in return for downloading one. That's how Scribd works anyway. You could just search for PDF, for example, PDF Empire of the Petal Throne or PDF Space 1899. And a lot of the time you can buy them, even though they're quite old, and certainly Weird Adventures you would still be able to buy. That is, you might try rpgnow.com, rpgnow.com, then search for Space 1899 or Empire of the Petal Throne or Weird Adventures. I'll put all this in the description as well. But the Weird Adventures guy does have a free document as well, which he had on his blog. So I'll put a link to that in the description. So there it is. Those are examples of what I think are quite original and interesting settings. You might take inspiration from them, from one or more of them. I hope that was useful or interesting for at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.